So, good morning, John.
Good
John
morning,
Coleman.
Lucy.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your time. John, you will know through our discussion before that we're involved in this sort of big education conversation now. I think we've got a real moment in, to just stop and think, what is the purpose of education, and and what would we change if we could, and if we had a magic wand. Thank you so much for sending me a copy of your book, which I would recommend to any. I've read it already. It's a wonderful read. It's called Teacher and the Teenage Brain, and it has just so many really good ideas in here from both, that sort of, I don't know, understanding what's going on in the teenage brain from a, and very accessible for somebody who's, knows not, sort of understanding that, the mechanics of the brain and so on. So it's just very, very accessible and some really practical ideas in there. And I know that you and I have worked together over a number of years, just thinking about the importance of sort of building psychological resources in young people. And so, I just was delighted to have you capture some of your thoughts and ideas that can sort of feed into that conversation. And I suppose start with, for you, what was so important for you to sort of write this book?
Okay, well, thank you for saying all that. It's great to hear. And it all started really with a project in Hertfordshire called My Team Brain. And originally, it was a project really to help practitioners, social workers, youth workers, those in the criminal justice system, to understand a bit more about young people. And particularly, I think they were thinking about risk and resilience. Mm-hmm. As the project developed and as we trained more people, it was fascinating because at the end of the sessions, the practitioners were saying, well, this is great for us, but what about, and the people that came up, the ideas that came up were first and foremost the young people themselves, but secondly, really the whole school environment. People were talking about whether we could run workshops for parents in the school setting, but the idea really came that this was important for a wider range of individuals and settings. And I started to think about, well, perhaps it should be written up in a form that was more accessible to a wider range of people, and talked to lots of people about it. And in the end, we decided really that teachers and schools were or are the right setting for writing about this. And of course, within that, I was able to talk about the workshops for parents, which we started to run in the school setting, workshops for teachers, of course, and also a lesson plan, which I developed for pupils themselves, particularly for years 9 and 10. So that's how it came about.
Fascinating. And one of the things that, I know in our work with Healthy Minds, but also I think comes out in the book, is that there's so much that we've learned about what's going on in the brain with new technologies and those sorts of things. And so, I don't know, I suppose we extend that idea based on your work. And if we had this idea, why is your work or these ideas about the teenage brain important and relevant for education? And I don't know, an even bigger question, like what would need to change, if we were really going to respond to the findings, really?
But that's a really good question. And of course, it has been very interesting for me, because when I started reading around what was being written in neuroscience and education, what I came across was the idea that actually it was very difficult to translate these ideas into work that would be useful for the classroom. Excuse me. People were writing, oh, it's too early, or it's too confusing, or there's too much sort of ideas that aren't based in any science. And I thought, well, I don't know that that's true. So I started to interview teachers, and I said to teachers, if you were going to have a session, a workshop on the brain and brain development in teenagers. What sort of things would you like to know? Well, of course, it was absolutely fascinating because they all, first of all, said yes, 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 but they also talked about understanding the students. So they talked about, why are they drowsy? I want to know why they're drowsy in the morning. I want to know why they can't always see the consequences of their actions. Why do they have meltdowns? Why do they get so emotional, for goodness sake? Why is the peer group so powerful? All those sorts of things. And so what came across to me was not that it was necessary to translate this into how you design a curriculum or how you manage, a classroom. What was really critical for teachers was understanding their students. And that, of course, goes back to the fact that in initial teacher training, they have very, very little introduction if you're training to be a secondary school teacher, very little introduction to human development or adolescent development. So that was very powerful. And in the book, I really write about that and write about the attitudes of the neuroscientists and the fact that the teachers themselves, when I talk to teachers, they don't say, oh, no, this is too soon to translate this, or it's too difficult to translate it into classroom activity or my work with students. Quite the contrary, it's incredibly valuable. And there's lots of stuff in the book about the evaluations I've done and how teachers have found this really so useful. So we could perhaps talk a bit more about why, but you said what has to change. You asked me that, and I think that there are a number of things that come out of this. I think, first of all, one of the things that ought to change is thinking about the brain development and how it impacts on students' behavior. And the things that I think particularly, being drowsy early in the morning, I think that we've learned that if you look at the brain of a 14-year-old and the brain of an adult at 9 o'clock in the morning, what you find is that in the adult, all the melatonin has disappeared. But in the teenager, there's still a lot of melatonin floating around because of the body clock and the fact that the melatonin is released later at night. So what are we doing in those first lessons in class? That, I think, and I've talked to a lot of teachers about this, that really we should be thinking about how the school day is structured. That's one thing. Second thing, I think, is about the if you like, the less than helpful impact of sitting still for a long time. So another thing that's really come out of this research is the necessity to get as much oxygen to the brain as possible. And that's led, and you probably know this, to a number of experiments in schools around what are called aerobic classrooms, where students don't sit still for they get up and move around. So that's another thing that comes out of it. But the broader thing, I think, is about cognitive development. And I think it's hugely helpful for teenagers, for teachers, I'm sorry, to know something of what's called executive function. That's the sort of skills that underpin the development of abstract thinking, scientific thinking, and so on. So executive function, things like working memory, how much information can you hold in your brain at any one time? We don't test memory in the classroom, and yet knowing how that changes and flourishes and develops as a result of brain development, it just changes the way teachers think about the sorts of things they're doing. And then the last thing, there are a number of things, but I'll just stick to one last thing. One of the things that really came across when I talked to teachers, particularly in sort of senior leadership teams, was they talked about learning as a result of this knowledge, about the capacity for change. And what they talked about was that very often when pupils transition from year 6 into year 7, and they haven't been doing so well in their primary school, and they struggle with the transition year, that there is a tendency among some, not all teachers, to think, well, that's it, that is the way this pupil is going to be. And so one of the most powerful lessons, I think, was about capacity for change, that teachers didn't really have the sense of understanding how this is a process, and how during these years, this brain that we have, that students have, has enormous capacity to mature, to develop in new ways. And so understanding that pupils are in a process, and that there is capacity for change, huge capacity for change, of course, because this is such a sensitive period in terms of human development, I think really has made a difference. And I know a number of head teachers and deputy heads have talked to me about why they want to have workshops for their teachers, and it's very much about understanding the capacity for change. So I think those are a few things that really, could make a very significant difference to the way schools function.
It's just absolutely fascinating, John. I mean, there's so much about what you say that, I mean, first of all, just really fills me with confidence. But I mean, what comes across is that the sort of structures for education are all for the purposes of adults.
Absolutely.
And if you think about teacher training, and as you say, I mean, it just absolutely surprises me that they do very little on child development. They do very little on, and yet actually when you talk to teachers and to senior leaders, that, they're so hungry for it, because they want to be able to respond and work in the best way for their children. It's just, so fascinating. And the other thing, that sort of sense of being able to change, it's one of the things that, that we talk about, the brain is malleable right the way through life. And actually, yes, that whole idea that, we get to a certain age and, so hearing that, I think, it just fills me with such confidence. And also, I had a conversation with Leslie Udwin just last week on, the really important younger, those early years, and the difference that it makes, in terms of making sure you get those early years right. But that that it's not lost if you don't get everything completely right. That malleability in the brain. And I think young people now, I mean, I had a conversation with a group of very articulate young people from a Healthy Minds school. So they teach once a week, a curriculum which underpinning it really is the ideas around sort of psychological development, I suppose, as well as other topics. But these young people from year 7 right the way through year 11 could really engage in a very, very thoughtful conversation about not only the content of what was being delivered, but also what they needed. And one of the things that was coming out really strongly was they wanted the stuff earlier and earlier. So, we talk about mental illness and mental ill health, but we wait until sort of year 9 and year 10 because we think they're not ready for it. And actually what the kids are saying is, look, we can get access to this information so we need it earlier. We want to have the copy. So again, I would just wonder, through the process of the project of writing the book, is there anything else that you would say about, giving confidence really to schools and to teachers about, not being frightened of engaging in, the conversation around some of those things? Perhaps talk about some of the challenges around it as well as, as we go.
Okay. Well, just to pick up your point about having it earlier, one of the, because I did lots of piloting, of course, and I spent lots of time in schools running particularly the lesson plan for students. And I did some work with years 11 and 12. And one of the, perhaps years 12 and year 12 particularly, I think. So that's the first A-level year. And one of the things that they said to me all the time was, it's fascinating, but why didn't we get this earlier? Why? I mean, this could have been so helpful to us. And young people themselves have said to me, learning that this is a process, it won't stay the same. It's something that's happening to me, and I'm gradually going through this journey with my brain gradually changing and restructuring and so on, all that's hugely reassuring. So absolutely. Yes, there were a lot of challenges. I think I mean, as far as teachers have been concerned, on the whole, I have found I've been welcomed with open arms. I think that I've come across very few teachers who are not or cannot see how relevant this is. I think the sorts of things that people say are things you will know only too well. You know, there isn't time in the curriculum where, you know, there's too many things, we're being asked to do too many different things and so on. But certainly for teachers, and also, of course, given COVID, the fact that we can do this online. I mean, I'm booked now through July and then through September and October to deliver to schools in that sort of twilight hour, as people call it. And of course, that it's all much easier now. I think the challenges I mean, there are different challenges for different groups. I think I'll say something about parents, and then I think the biggest challenges were with students themselves. So with parents, there was the attitude that it's very difficult to get parents engaged in anything like this. You know, you set up something on drugs, for example, and you get a handful of parents turning up because it's in the evening, and B, because they don't want to be seen as you know, going to something like this. And if their sons or daughters think that they're going to that, then they think that their parents believe that, you know, they're you know, doing things they shouldn't do. They're doing drugs and so on. And one of the things that we had to do was to persuade schools that this would be attractive. And schools were amazed, because particularly the schools which really put some effort into publicizing it, particularly through social media and so on. I mean, we got hundreds, not just a handful. I mean, I can remember one school in Bedford Borough where we had to change venue 3 times, and we ended up doing it in the school gymnasium with about 200 parents, and everyone said, oh, you can't do that, and it's important for parents to talk to each other, but actually it was fantastic. And of course they talked to each other, and they would turn around and talk to the person behind them, and they weren't shy in asking questions. And yeah, so I've had some really, really good experiences. But I do think for parents, you've got to have a sort of marriage of the trainer or trainers and the schools being willing. So Bedford Borough is interesting because it's small, and they've only got, you probably know this, they've only got 12 secondary schools, and they've got a dedicated training team in the Early Help Centre. And they are still running my program, My Team Brain. They've just run it in every secondary school in the last 2 terms, and they're going to do it again in 21-22. So there you've got the capacity, and you've got the relatively small group of schools, so they talk to each other, and that level of interest. In Hertfordshire, which of course is much, much bigger, we've got a group of schools that are very interested and committed and are sending people on the training, but that's not all the secondary schools. So, I mean, we could do a lot more in reaching out. And there are other local authorities, Buckinghamshire, Northampton, are interested, but I think capacity and resources and so on, as you know only too well, really, you know, do play a big part. As far as the young people were concerned, that was much more challenging. Partly because I was contracted to do 1 lesson. The idea was to do a lesson plan just for one 45-minute lesson. That was tricky because how do you put something in there? What do you
put in and what do you leave out?
It was tricky because everyone, teachers were saying, well, where does it fit in the curriculum? Is it PSHE or is it something else? Is it part of GCSE biology? Well, not really. Who's going to teach it? That was another big thing. And so, it was tricky. And I must have run it myself 20, 25 times, I suppose, had lots of different experiences, some very depressing, some very funny. There was one wonderful one where they'd shoehorned me in to, I'd been working with a very, very nice teacher, but she was a deputy head, but she was also the Italian teacher. And so she shoehorned me into an Italian lesson. And these poor year nines, they couldn't get their heads around it. The first question was, are you an Italian professor? No, I'm not an Italian professor. So are you going to talk to us in Italian? No, I'm going to talk to you about the brain.
Yeah.
No, the Italian brain? No, not the Italian brain. Anyway, it took me 15 minutes before I even started. So, you get these sorts of experiences. So I think the challenges are, well, I should say that when I've done, so once we had the materials, once I felt reasonably confident with the lesson plan, then I started doing teacher training for it, or workshops. But then the teachers who came were very, very interested, but they said, this material was too much, for a 45-minute. You're never going to get all this. And there's so many things that we could explore here with the students. And so almost all of them said, well, we're going to make it 2 lessons. And there were a number of schools that actually said, well, I think what would be best would be to run it over a whole week. So you'd start on Monday with an assembly, let's say, then on Tuesday, you'd set them off, with a little bit of a project. They had to go and read up about the brain on Google or whatever. Then on Wednesday, they'd all come together for a discussion about it. Thursday, they'd do this. And then Friday, you'd finish it off with another. And people, are doing that. But it's hard. I suppose that's the other challenge. Where do you find the trainers to do this sort of thing? And so one of the really positive things has been that I found charities voluntary sector organizations, particularly Charlie Waller, and I've trained a number of their trainers, and then they're spreading out. So they're running it in schools. Actually, this week, I'm doing 40 schools in the Southwest, and we're doing 2 lots, so a total of 3 hours for 4 teachers in every one of those schools, which, that's great. But obviously, there's a limit to how much you can do. So I think that's a sort of brief summary of some of the challenges.
Yeah, and again, I just think that's so interesting, John, because our model at Bounce Forward has always been to train the teachers in the school, which has all the same challenges that you say, because you still got to think about where it fits in the timetable, but just that sense of one of the things that has always been an unintended outcome of our work has been the impact that it has on staff as well. So it's really interesting that I think both things are coming at it from, I don't know, the sort of science of brain development and that understanding of the neuroscience in a way which is practical and can be delivered in schools.
Yeah.
And you will know that our sort of broaden the conversation out a little bit. Our work has always been to think about the well-being of students, and not as a response to mental ill health, but just because looking after our well-being is a good thing to do in itself. And I wondered if you noticed any outcomes that you had around the well-being of students, although you were coming at it again from a very sort of scientific approach to the brain.
Yeah. Well, that's good. And I was going to bring this up because that sort of dialogue has been going through the whole project. So initially, it was interesting that the people who are paying me were basically saying, well, we want this because we want to address the whole issue of mental health problems in school. And I was saying, in one lesson, that this isn't appropriate. There are other things that you can do. And one of the things that I talk about in the book is that I was interested. There was one lesson when I was standing up there, and I realized that I was telling these young people what was changing for them. And I suddenly thought, has anyone ever asked them what they think is changing? And so I developed something called the change questionnaire. It's terribly simple. It simply is a list of things. And it starts by saying, since you became a teenager, do you think, so your memories got better or worse? Do you think you're more moody or less moody? Do you think your stress level is higher or lower since you're a teenager? And so there are about 10 items on this change question. It's terribly simple. And I've got 500 responses are in the book. And one of the things that is most striking about that is that the item which has the most consensus among young people is about stress, that they experience the teenage years as being more stressful.
Yeah.
And this won't surprise you, but when you ask them what it is that is stressful for them, the almost universal answer is it's school. Yeah. It's pressure from teachers, pressure from parents about homework, it's revision, it's tests. That is what makes life really stressful.
And I suppose pressure for themselves as well, the pressure they put on themselves as well to be able to respond to that, that external pressure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, one of the things that I had wanted to put into the lesson plan was something about hormones, because I think that's, so that's absolutely central. Dopamine, obviously, serotonin, melatonin, and so on. So I thought about cortisol, and I thought about helping them to understand a little bit about how stress impacts on brain development and how the changes that they're going through will impact on the way they experience stress. So I do have a section of the lesson plan on stress. So that's the closest link, I suppose, I would make with well-being, because the students themselves, when you ask them, they say that they hadn't thought about stress in that way. They hadn't thought about how their brains might be dealing with stress. They hadn't thought about the fact that there is a bit more cortisol in their amygdala. They didn't know about amygdalas, and a lot of them say that's really helpful. And then in the lesson plan, I talk about how people deal with stress. So I have a little questionnaire. When you're stressful, what do you do? Do you go for a run? Do you take the dog for a walk? Do you go straight to the fridge? Do you play good music, and so on? So I get them to think about the fact that we all deal with stress differently. There's no single right answer, obviously, but they are in control. They can do something. So it's really about giving them some agency.
Yeah.
And so I think that is a contribution to well-being. I think, I don't have to tell you, you probably know more than anyone about this. You can't in one lesson or even a week, there's obviously a very limited amount you can do. But I think two things. I think to help students understand this is a process, this is a change that they're going through, and that there's lots of positives. The brain maturing leads to lots of positives. They can do new things, they can do things they couldn't do before, but it is also a period of reorganization and restructuring, which means that there will be times when they'll feel uncertain, make it difficult to make decisions, and so on. And the hormone variation impacts on their moods and their sense of being gloomy at one time and being very happy at another, and those things are really it's huge insight for students, for young people. They simply don't know that, and so I think that is a huge contribution to well-being. And I think that you were asking what can change. I think I've always thought that there should be an element of human development, psychology and human development in the secondary school curriculum, because I mean, I can see it is really helpful for young people. And I know that from all the work I do with young people, whether it's individually when they're struggling, or whether it's in a classroom setting. This stuff really makes a difference. So I absolutely believe that we should have more of this.
I mean, it's just, you know, it's so interesting, isn't it, that if you think about what is taught in the curriculum, and I know there's been conversations about it across all sorts of topics, including, you know, the way we teach history, what we teach, how we teach it, you know, and I think one of the things that comes out very clearly in the book is you know, the advances in technology have really helped us to be able to understand and then translate it to sort of lay terms what, you know, because I think one of the things that's always frightening is, you know, are you giving young people excuses then to, well, and you know, that's to do with my brain, you know, but you know, so I think, you know, that can be one of the resistances that you see. But, you know, and I know you've already said, but sort of more broadly, John, for you, why would the topic of the teenage brain be something that we all need to be thinking more about, whether that's as a parent thinking about their children, whether that's about teachers in schools, whether it's about policymakers and thinking about, you know, why for you is it so important that we pay attention to what we understand now about the teenage brain in those conversations?
Very interesting about blame my brain, that sort of discourse. Do you know, in all the work that I've done, in all the hundreds and hundreds of professionals, whether teachers, youth workers, social workers, I think that's come up about 0.1% of the time. I mean, I know it is a sort of discourse that does appear, and of course it's in relation to the criminal justice system particularly. And in America, there are cases where the defense has used this, but I think it's very, very unusual here.
And just for one sec though, John, I might push back, because I do think that there are certain arms within the Department for Education that think this is about, you know, if you think about the behaviour strategy and if you think about the exclusions, I think that idea is, you know, it might be implicit, but I do think it's there, and I do think it, you know, it does, you know, inform broader policy around what good and bad behaviour looks like. Do you know what I mean? And what we would expect from young people.
No, I can't disagree with you. I don't like to agree, but I think you are right, and I think that is a worry. But you know, there are some pretty peculiar beliefs within government. And you know, I think we have to be robust in addressing them. I think that you know, another way of thinking about this is really to talk about the fact that I mean, everyone knows that we want to improve young people's sense of their self, their self-worth, and people know that is linked to educational achievement. The more, so I think, you know, and giving them agency, giving them some sense of having control over their lives and being able to manage their feelings and their emotions, and you know, having fewer meltdowns, if you like, but also understanding something about what lies behind this, and thinking about, I mean, you know, everyone's you know, aware of you know, the idea of you know, helping young people understand something about themselves. I mean, that's what your work is all about, isn't it, really? So I think we have to address it. I agree it is a worry. I agree it is a worry. I think that there's that, and there's also this idea that the neuro myths, there are so many neuro myths around. Oh, I mean, we just don't know enough yet to be able to do anything about this. There's lots of silly ideas floating around, which and people have used the brain. I mean, you can read about the brain and the economy, you can read about the brain and nutrition, the brain is used all the time. But I just think you've got to make a very strong argument. One of the things that I haven't said is that I always say to teachers, to any professionals, that whatever I'm going to cover now is acceptable or accept by all reputable scientists. So you can find any book on the teenage brain, and what I'm going to say you will find there. So I'm not going to go into the wilder pastures of new ideas. What I'm going to tell you, you will find in any reputable science book. And I think that's an important message, that this material that I'm using, this new knowledge, as you say, as a result of extraordinary advances in technology, it is, I'm sticking to the findings that are agreed by everyone. So that's very important. I think the other thing that is really interesting about this is it is a new field of science, and I liken it often to genetics, genomics. I say, it's nearly 60 years since the double helix, and huge advances have been made, but there's still things being discovered about genetic makeup, and the impact of that is being felt in medicine across. And I say, we're only 20 years into neuroscience as a result of scanning, and scanning itself is changing. And one of the things that I often talk about is that one of the reasons why we have so little data on young people with learning disabilities, those with mental health problems, those on the autistic spectrum and so on, is because it's very difficult to get young people who might be anxious or fidgety to lie down, go in a tunnel with a lot of noise going on and stay still for 35 to 40 minutes. That's really tricky. And that's why almost all the data is derived from individuals who have got the capacity to lie still and so on. But, in 2014 or 2015, I used to joke that, if I came back in 25 years, we'd have scanning technology which you could have on your head, you could walk around. Well, that's happened. That's already there. It's expensive, but that's there now. So the technology is changing and developing, and that's going to open up new windows. You'll be able to do it in the classroom. You'll be able to do it on the sports field. You'll be all sorts of things. So that's very important. I think making the statement that we're at a very, very early stage, but what we know is the degree of change in the brain during these teenage years, and that's the really critical thing. And we know what changes as well.
I mean, I love the way you talk, because what you're doing there is you're providing a structure, a very clear structure, from then which in you can have a very, interesting and complex and layered conversation, and that's what we say about the teaching and learning. And for me, that goes back whether in my early days, I was about drug education. There was all this fear about, if you talk about, if you talk about sex too early, then actually, if you provide the really the safety of the framework, and you're very clear about what you're not talking about, as well as and what's appropriate and not, then I think that agency that we know is so essential for young people's success, and also which is coming out very, very clearly, I think, in the data now. We recently had a conversation with researchers at the London School of Economics, who are talking about, if you look at what success So if you go back 50 years, we needed physical strength for success. If you go back 20 years, we needed 10 years, we needed intellectual resources for it. If you go forward, probably not even 10 years, actually that emotional intelligence, that understanding of self, that agency is absolutely is what is going to be needed for success. So, you know, I just think, you know, us being able to understand, you know, in very sort of, I'm going to say simple and basic, but I don't mean that, very accessible way to just help us be able to understand, I think is, you know, is so important. I mean, I suppose that's where I'd just like to finish the conversation, John, really. So for me, the main reason that I would say I would encourage any teaching professional and actually any parent to pick up this book, actually, because I think there's so much, you know, good stuff in here. But I love the way it starts, you know, the 10 things that you would want to pass on. You know, I think that in itself, it's worth reading it. But where would you leave us? Why do you think it's important that teaching professionals or others might pick up and read your book?
I think it's been the most rewarding project that I've done in all my professional life. Really? I've done lots of different things. And I think the thing is, Lucy, when people say, this is a light bulb moment, or when a teacher says to me, oh my God, this is so interesting.
Makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck, just you saying it, yeah.
How is it? I didn't know this stuff. You know, those sorts of things. I mean, you know, we know, you and I know that this can really change. And I've had people write to me, honestly, this is honestly true. I've had people write to me to say, my relationship with my teenager has changed.
Yeah.
The family situation has changed. I do not talk to my teenager in the same way. And the conflict level has gone right down. When I'm thinking about her or his emotional ups and downs, I don't go, what are you doing to me? I go, okay, you know, this is part of what's going on. And I think about the brain and I think, okay, step back. You know, I mean, how more valuable can you get information, new knowledge than to have that impact? So yeah, that's what I'd say. It's just hugely rewarding to know. And I just hope that, you know, this knowledge can be disseminated in as wide a way as possible. And I'm very grateful to you for that.
Yeah, I mean, just taking the fear out of it, giving people that understanding, and then they're able to, you know, to use it and to move forward. So yeah, John Coleman, thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure as always. Thank you for your time and thank you for contributing to the big education conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be with you this morning. Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.